Hey everybody, this is Philip from the Libertarian Radical Caucus, and I wanted to take a few minutes to post a response to the CNN Libertarian Town Hall that aired a few days ago. And the idea for this was something that was suggested by another member of the Libertarian Radical Caucus who proposed that members of the LRC post their own interpretation or analysis of the town hall. And the idea behind that is basically that Gary and Bill are not necessarily what you would call radical libertarians. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about what it means to be a radical libertarian if you're not already familiar with that term. May mention it briefly and talk about the definition just a little bit, but I'm not going to try to go too deep into that aspect of libertarian philosophy. But, basically Bill and Gary are pragmatic guys who are promoting a message that's libertarian, maybe what some people call the small L sense, and they're big L and they're members of the Libertarian Party, but they're definitely not promoting a message that's a really strict, or it has a really strict adherence to that really kind of the core of libertarian philosophy. So radical members wanted to kind of come back and post their own take on some of the same questions that Bill and Gary answered, and give you the take from the radical perspective. Now, I want to point out one important thing is that I am totally supporting Gary Johnson and Bill Weld. In no way is this meant to, be an attack or take away from their campaign. I'm totally Gary supporter. I will be voting for Gary and definitely am working to, promote his campaign. So all of this, what I'm going to say, look at it as just expanding on or adding to what Gary and Bill said in the town hall. In most places, I don't think I'm going to say anything that will contradict what they said. Or if there is any extent to which I contradict them, it should be kind of a minor point or something where there's some ambiguity or subtlety to the thing anyway. Now, I don't have enough time free to go through every question they were asked and break the whole thing down, so I think I'll try to stick to just 2 points, and that is, one, the first question I think they were asked was, what does it mean to be a libertarian? I think a lot of people would say that their answer was kind of okay, it got there, but it didn't maybe really capture the essence of what it means to be a libertarian. And for something that was going to an audience of people who maybe aren't familiar with the libertarian philosophy, there was a thing maybe it didn't do enough to really explain why our position is different from the other parties. And then I think I will try to tackle the question that they received about drug laws and war on drugs and prohibition. So to go back to the first question, what does it mean to be a libertarian? Well, I think what Gary said that really kind of came closest to capturing the spirit of it was when he said, we always come down on the side of choice. And if you had to pick just one word to summarize what it means to be a libertarian, choice actually would be a pretty good word for that. There are other words that you could put in there. Freedom would be one. I don't know if it's really a compound word or 2 words, but non-aggression would really be a good one. Peace actually would be a pretty good choice as well, which dovetails with non-aggression. But yeah, so he said choice, they come down on the side of choice. And what really we're saying there is that you as an individual have a fundamental right to do essentially anything you want, with the only real restriction of that being you can't violate anybody else's rights in the process. Or in other words, you have the freedom to choose to do anything. And when you think about any question of policy from a libertarian perspective, you should always look at it in terms of, does anyone have any standing to violate your right to choose what you're going to do in a particular situation? So to kind of go ahead and jump forward a little bit to the drug issue, the question is, am I free to choose what substances I want to put in my body? And the answer to that question should always be yes. And it goes without saying almost. And I'll talk a little bit more about like self-ownership and how that comes into play in a minute. But the idea is that I should be free to choose, what substance to put in my body, and what job to have, what business to start, really anything, whether it's an economic question, a social question, choice really comes, rather what I should say there's everything should come down to choice as the key principle. Now, what does it mean to say as a government position to say we come down on the side of choice? Well, really what that's saying is that the government is not going to try to interfere with that freedom on your part to make that choice. So the libertarian position is that, by and large, the government should not ever interfere with your freedom to make choices. Another way of looking at it would be to say this. There was a fairly well-known French economist and philosopher named Frederick Bastiat, and he talked a lot about what the rightful purpose of the law is, or what a just law is. And his position was framed in these terms. If an individual can't do something rightfully, in other words, I can't walk up to you and punch you in the face for no reason, because that's violating your rights. If one person can't do something, I can't, put a gun in your face and say, give me your money. If one person can't do it, then a whole bunch of people can't do it either, just because there's a lot of them, right? So if one person stands in front of you with a gun pointed at you and says, give me your money, that's a crime. If 20 people do it, it's still a crime. If 100,000 people do it, it's still a crime. If 250 million some people do it, and they do it indirectly by voting, and saying we delegate this, crime power to this entity and we're going to call it government, it's still a crime. So whenever we talk, for example, about taxation, taxation is backed by the idea of government force. That is, if you choose not to, pay your taxes, as they say, then ultimately the state will send men with guns to come and arrest you. And if you try to resist them, you will ultimately get shot. So they're using force to violate your freedom to choose what to do with the fruits of your labor. Okay, so the libertarian position is always that you should not use force to violate someone else's right to choose or to violate their property rights. And I said earlier, I'd mentioned self-ownership. So self-ownership is basically the idea that a lot of your rights are rooted in the fact that you own yourself. That is, you own your body, it's yours. So what you do to it or what you do with it is totally up to you, and no one else has any standing to argue with that. So I also said earlier non-violence or non-aggression, and that really is usually positioned as the fundamental aspect of libertarian philosophy, something called the non-aggression principle. You may also hear it called the zero aggression principle, or the non-initiation of force principle. And it basically says it's always morally wrong to initiate force or violence to achieve any kind of political end. Really, except in self-defense, and that's kind of the one exception people make, is that if someone else attacks you, then yes, it's okay to use force. Libertarians are not necessarily pacifists. So you can use force, but only for defensive purposes. And that goes back to what Bastiat said, which was that government should only be the collective extension to what is our individual right to self-defense. In other words, if I have the right to defend myself, then I also, by extension, have the right to team up with 5 or 10 or 1,000 or 1,000,000 or 250 million of my neighbors and say, we will work together to defend ourselves. And so anything government does that ultimately is just defending our rights is a just purpose for government. Anytime the government purports to use force to do anything else, then arguably it's wrong. From a libertarian perspective, it's wrong. So that's kind of the core aspect of what it means to be a libertarian, is to believe that you should not use force to violate people's right to choose, or to violate their property rights. In other words, taking someone's property away from them is violating their freedom of choice in terms of violating their ability to choose how to control their property. So you can sort of look at property rights and freedom of choice as being inherently related. And we're probably getting a little bit deeper into really kind of subtle issues of libertarian philosophy than we need to ask, or to answer the question, what does it mean to be a libertarian? But to kind of summarize what it means to be a libertarian, it means believing that you should not initiate force or use violence to achieve any end. It means you believe that you own yourself and you have the right to choose what to do with your body. It means that you have the right to control your property and control the fruits of your labor. And I think that's really kind of the key aspect of it. If you understand the non-aggression principle, you can usually derive the libertarian position on almost any issue by just working forward from first principles. And that's the reason that the Libertarian Party has the tagline or the slogan, the party of principle, because the LP positions are based on a small handset of core principles, and everything goes back to those principles. And you can always just start with the principle and work your way forward logically and figure out our position really on any topic. Yeah, the other thing I was going to add to that is to say that on almost any issue of policy, you should probably always kind of frame the discussion in terms of what is a valid role for government. And that is kind of why I wanted to talk about what does it mean to be a libertarian first, and explain a little bit more about libertarian philosophy. Because if you're going to ask a question like, what about drug prohibition? Okay, the real question isn't, are drugs good? Are drugs bad? Should people take drugs? None of those things are the right question. The question isn't, will eliminating drug laws reduce drug usage or make society safer? None of those questions are really the right question to ask if you're going to talk about, government-backed drug prohibition. The question to ask is always, is doing that a proper role for government in the first place? And going back to what we said earlier about how you should never use the initiation of force to achieve any political end, then the proper libertarian position would be to say, no, it's not a proper role for government to use force to try to prevent people from taking drugs. Now, the important thing I want to add to that is this. Saying that it's not a proper role for government to do drug prohibition is not, let me just emphasize that, it is not the same thing as saying that people should take drugs or that drugs aren't bad. Okay, now, not all drugs are bad as it is, and I certainly have no problem with people choosing to smoke marijuana or really do whatever they want. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that I'm advocating for people to smoke marijuana or use heroin or anything. It's just an issue of you own your body. You have the right to choose how you want to live your life and what you want to do with your body. And if you want to put marijuana, heroin, opium, cocaine, crack, whatever, formaldehyde in your body, then that's your choice. So when the lady brought up her son who had used heroin, I believe it was, and was badly injured and everything, I mean, that's tragic. Okay, I mean, and libertarians certainly have a tremendous amount of empathy. And that may be kind of a stereotype that libertarians are cold and heartless and believe in this sort of dog-eat-dog world and whatever. And that's really not true at all. It's a straw man, kind of a caricature that was created by people who don't support libertarian philosophy, as a way to attack us. But every libertarian, I think, would say that they feel terrible that something like that happened to her son and to every other victim of improper use of drugs or whatever it might be. But as much empathy as I might feel for that specific individual and what happened to them, it is still the case that somebody made a choice. And in this case, her son chose to use heroin. That is, I'm assuming he wasn't forced to do it at gunpoint, right? And something tragic happened. But in no way does that justify saying that, in turn, government should then put a gun in the face of everybody else out there and violate their right to choice. And that actually goes back to another idea I wanted to bring up earlier when we were talking about what does it mean to be a libertarian. There's another little catchphrase or slogan that you will hear sometimes that really captures the spirit of it as well. And I should have said this earlier, but I'll back up a little bit. You'll hear the expression individual freedom, personal responsibility associated with libertarians quite a bit. And the idea there is just to say that as an individual, you have the freedom to choose anything within the constraints that we spoke about earlier. But then the price of that freedom is that you have the responsibility for dealing with the outcome of your actions. Okay, so saying that it's okay to take drugs in the sense that government should not, be using force to prevent you from doing it is not the same thing as saying that you should be free from the liability for the consequences of your actions, whether that impacts you or somebody else. And to take the example, when I first mentioned being a libertarian to my mom, for example, when we were talking about drug policy, and I was talking about how everyone who is in jail for any nonviolent drug crime, just possession or sales, should be freed. And she thought this was a horrible idea on kind of a knee-jerk level and reacted to it, with kind of a negative tone. And the point I was trying to make to her is saying that you should be free to take drugs and saying that drug consumers and even drug dealers should be free isn't the same thing as advocating for taking drugs. And it's the same thing as saying that if your use of drugs causes you to hurt somebody else, that you shouldn't be held liable for, that actual outcome. And that's really the key point I wanted to get to with all that, was to say that if you go out and get high, legally, let's say in a world where it is legal to get high, and you go get in your car and you drive around for 2 hours and nothing happens, and you come home, park your car, and go back inside. Have you committed a crime? Well, you were driving while under an influence, which would be considered a crime currently under our legal system, but you didn't hurt anybody. Okay, you didn't infringe anybody's rights. No harm was caused, no damage was done. So from a libertarian perspective, we would argue that no, you didn't actually commit a crime. On the other hand, if you get high or drunk, whatever, right? You get in your car, you go out, you drive, and you run into something, and you hurt or kill somebody or harm somebody's property. If drinking or smoking weed or doing whatever you were doing is legal, that isn't the same thing as saying that you aren't still responsible for the liability associated with the fact that you caused harm to somebody. So if I run through the front plate glass window of your business, I'm still responsible for replacing the plate glass window and cleaning up the damage and whatever, regardless of whether or not I had consumed any kind of drug or intoxicating substance, right? So personal freedom or individual freedom, personal responsibility, and to go back to the thing about the lady with the son and anybody who is maybe contesting that yes, drugs should be illegal. Well, no, I mean, because at the end of the day, you make a choice whether or not to do something like consuming cocaine, heroin, marijuana, opium, whatever. And sometimes, again, really tragic things happen. But that, again, is the price of freedom, is that sometimes people are going to make bad choices, and sometimes tragic things are going to happen, and it's horrible. Okay, and I don't want to make light of it. I, again, feel as bad about what happened to her and her son and everybody else out there who's ever been harmed by these things. Now, I feel as bad about that as anybody. But again, the question is it a proper role for government to run around putting guns in everyone's faces to prevent them from making a certain choice, which might or might not cause any harm to anybody? So that was kind of a long-winded diatribe there, covering what does it mean to be a libertarian and covering the idea of drug prohibition. There are other things we could say about the drug prohibition thing, and just, I guess, real quickly, let me hit at this point. There's another aspect of this war on drugs and drug prohibition thing that libertarians will often talk about and rail about for good reasons. One is anytime you have prohibition, it usually creates more violence, and because it creates a black market for whatever's being prohibited, right? And when you have that black market, you have artificially distorted profit margins because there's a distortion in the free market caused by the government. So because you have that artificially inflated profit, then you have a profit motive for people to go out and deal in these things. But because it's being done in that black market environment, it's being done in a situation where it's not legal in the traditional sense, then you get this separate economy that's running kind of outside of the normal bounds of things, and you get things like organized crime and gang wars and kind of the rest of the violence that goes along with that. So having prohibition has pretty much always resulted in more crime, more violence in terms of the organized crime, the gang wars and things like that go along with it. So we believe that ending the war on drugs would actually make society safer in that regard. You'd see less gun crime, less violence in general associated with that. And then the other aspect that goes along with that, actually I forgot what I was about to say there. A little bit of a brain fart. There was totally another angle on that I wanted to get into, but it slipped my mind. I'm doing this a little bit off the cuff. If you guys can't tell, I didn't script any of this. I decided just to ramble a little bit. But either way, I've probably gone long enough, so I'll just leave this here, and maybe later I'll come back and do another video. Maybe just kind of simply redo this one and try to get a little bit of a better recording with fewer uhs and ahs and whatnot. But that's the essence from my perspective, my interpretation, what it means to be a libertarian, and my take on, the government's role in terms of drug prohibition. And the last thing I'll say is just, if you're thinking about the libertarian position, you're thinking about what it means to be a libertarian, you're maybe considering voting for libertarians, or maybe you're thinking about joining the Libertarian Party, or even running for office as a libertarian. I'll just reiterate that the key question really always ought to be, what is a proper role for this thing that we're going to call government? And Bastiat maybe wouldn't have used the word libertarian to describe himself. The Libertarian Party, as we know it today, didn't exist yet when he wrote his famous tract, The Law. I forget what year it was written, but it was hundreds of years ago. But he really nailed that core essence of a lot of people's take on libertarianism by saying that government can be no more justly than the collective extension to our individual right to self-defense. So anytime you're going to ask what is the libertarian position on something, just think about it in terms of what is the position where the government is only acting as the collective extension to the individual right to self-defense. And if you break that down, you go through it logically, you will probably arrive at the position that most other libertarians arrive at. There are a few issues where there's some ambiguity, and there's some things where you can question certain things based on how you define certain things. And I don't have time to get into all that real deeply. I'll kind of jump forward a little bit and just say that abortion is one topic where you can be a libertarian and reason logically from first principles and have a good faith position, rooted in sound libertarian thinking, and come down on either side of the issue. And it really gets down to a question of definitions. What do you define as a human being? What do you define as, life? And in my case, because we don't have good objective answers to those questions, that's why I come down on the side of being pro-choice, exactly because there are some questions that we can't answer in a really objective fashion. And so it makes sense to just always default to a case where you're not invoking government, and you're not invoking use of force. And that might be another good way of summarizing the libertarian take, is that you should always default to not using force if there is any ambiguity. But either way, that's enough of my rambling for now. So that's my take on the CNN Libertarian Town Hall and a couple of the questions that Gary and Bill were asked. I hope some of you find this useful. Please feel free to leave a comment or whatever. Comments, flames, criticisms, whatever. They're all welcome. If you post something I don't like, I'll just delete it. So have fun and have a good day.